Welcome to the Learning Ideas Conference Winter Event Interviews. I'm David Guralnick, and I'm here with Bruce McLaren. Bruce is an associate research professor at Carnegie Mellon University at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute. And we're really happy to have Bruce with us today to talk about his work on digital learning games and some other things. So Bruce, it's great to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So yes, if we can start off, maybe if you want to talk a little bit about some of the work you're doing on digital learning games, and then we can go from there.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I have a background in a variety of areas related to educational technology, including intelligent tutoring systems and collaborative learning systems. But over the last 10 years or so, I've been especially interested in digital learning games, and I've been doing research in that area. My lab developed a game that I've done a variety of studies with. I've collaborated with game designers with respect to coming up with new game ideas. So that's kind of my main interest, and it has been for some time.
Oh, that's great. Well, can you tell me a little bit more about the types of games that you're designing and who the audience is and what you're trying to accomplish?
Okay, I've mainly been looking at K-12 and even more specifically at middle school students. And the game that we designed is called Decimal Point. As the name connotes, we've primarily been looking at students learning about decimal fractions. And basically the idea is it's an amusement park metaphor. A student moves their way through this park and they play these, what we call mini games, to help them overcome decimal misconceptions. And interestingly enough, decimals obviously is a very fundamental mathematics topic, but it also is an area that even older learners struggle with. There's research that's shown that even into adulthood, and even teachers sometimes make really common decimal mistakes. So it's a really important area of mathematics, and that's why we chose to focus on that. And we've had a really interesting run with it, and probably the most interesting thing that we found is our game actually has benefited female students more than male students. And we've consistently found that. We've repeated that result in a number of studies, and I have a PhD student who's actually focusing on that as his topic for his PhD.
That's really interesting. In terms of how the game works, you mentioned a little bit, but can you tell us a little bit more detail about what the game experience is like for someone who's going through it?
Yeah, so basically what they do is they start in this amusement park, and it's like a lot of amusement parks that have these theme areas. And what they see on the screen is a map of the amusement park, and there's theme areas like space adventure or Western adventure. And within each of those areas, there are these, what we call mini games, as I mentioned earlier, where they do things like try to place a point on a number line, where they order decimals in sequence, but they do that within the context of the game. So for instance, we have one game called the Western Shooter game. And what that is that you see on the screen a number of these small items like a boot, some other kind of Western motif item, and it has a decimal number on it, and they're expected to shoot those in that order. Or there's another game that is again kind of a Western thing where there's horses that have decimals on them, and you have to corral them in two different areas where they're in the middle. There's a decimal that is greater than some of the decimals that are on the horses and less than others. And what the student has to do is sort of corral the horses into each of these areas. So that's essentially how the game works. Those are a couple examples of these mini games that I was describing earlier.
Yeah, and let me ask you kind of a different question, because I know a lot of your work kind of been on the research side as well. And so can you talk a little bit about what theories are underlying some of the game design and how that connects to the experience that you've created?
Sure. I got really interested in this area because, as probably everyone has heard, there's a lot of hype about digital games and their potential for learning, the motivational factor of it, the fact that most of these games have more of a sort of an exciting feeling to them, more than just question answer, typical kinds of educational technology. So that's kind of an intuitive belief. But one thing that I found out at the time when I first started doing this work is there wasn't a lot of empirical evidence that it actually was leading to benefits. There were a bunch of people who sort of proselytized about, oh yeah, games are great for learning. But when I looked around, and especially in math, interestingly enough, there wasn't really much evidence. So Richard Mayer, who is a psychologist, educational psychologist at University of California, Santa Barbara, has been a collaborator of mine. And he and I started to talk about this. And he actually wrote a book on computer games for learning. I think it came out in 2014. And he, in his investigations, had found that there were only a handful of math games that had been developed that had been experimented with enough that there was some evidence that was beneficial for learning. So he and I actually collaborated in the original work. The two of us sort of brainstormed this game and the approach that we took. And we did get evidence. We compared the game to an equivalent tutoring system, more standard educational technology that didn't have the game elements in it. And we were able to show that the game led to better learning outcomes than what we called the non-game. So ours was one of the first games that actually showed the benefits. Now that was, as I mentioned, that was 2014. That's a long time ago. And I think in the intervening years, there's been lots of evidence that games lead to learning. And especially for your audience, I think would be interesting is this idea of what's called gamification, where you take an existing piece of technology and you add extra elements that make it more game-like. So we developed our game originally as an idea that this is going to be a game, but there's lots of work that's been done with taking existing technology and adding game elements to it. So this is all good news because it does look as though the intuition now has some empirical, has more than some, has a good body of evidence behind it now.
Yeah, let me ask you sort of a follow-up question, particularly in light of the gamification reference and discussion. What have you found in your work in terms of designing the right game so that the experience feels appropriately authentic? Like, are there cases where you really lose the learning experience because the game is a little bit too much tacked on versus how to better integrate the game into the learning experience? Can you share some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that's a really, really important point, because I think what's happened in a lot of instances is, gamification has caught on as a topic, and thus, it's been kind of just glommed onto systems like having leaderboards or having very simple game-like attributes added to games, which in a lot of instances, I think hasn't really resulted in any real benefit. So that's one of the reasons why I'm more of an advocate. There is evidence that gamification can make a difference, but there's actually more evidence than that if you build a game from scratch, you're more likely to get the benefits of learning, because you can really carefully look at that balance between motivation and learning. Because on one hand, you really want to get somebody engaged in what they're doing. I mean, there's clearly benefits to that, the motivational side of it. But if you don't carefully look at the content that you're trying to convey and have the student learn or the adult learner learn, you can lose that by having too much engaging material so that the learning is lost, or not enough to really help with the motivation. So there's this balance. And that's actually the thing that initially excited me about game-based learning, is this sort of tension, if you will, between producing engagement on one hand and learning on the other. And ultimately, you want the learning, but if you can make it fun and exciting, well, that's the real holy grail, I guess, and the real win.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think in the area that you've chosen, it seems like that's a particularly challenging one, right? Because most of the real situations where people use decimals are probably not particularly exciting situations to middle school students, right? So you've got a bit of there are some things like if they're learning some things about probability and odds, well, you could probably create interesting situations about betting and about just following the horse analogy or sports, and get to something interesting that's really a true real life task, and they can see the application. But here you're probably a step away. So a lot of the financial things you might want to do would probably not be of interest. So when you thought about what kinds of game experiences you would have, like, how did you come up with kind of the creative part, the horses and the other kinds of examples used?
That's a great comment and commentary about it, because traditionally how students learn about decimals in school, which turns out isn't necessarily the best, is as you might expect, with money, because you have the tenths and the hundredths place that you can teach students. The problem with that approach is that students kind of think, well, that's the end of it. And they don't realize the decimals can be longer than that. And they can be, more detail than that. So if you just focus on using money as the metaphor for learning about decimals, it's not enough, and it can actually be a bad thing for students. So we went through a process, a lot of brainstorming. It was actually a really fun process where I was able to get some really smart undergraduate students involved in the process of designing and developing the game. And we started by looking at, well, what are typical misconceptions that students have? So instead of just making up ideas about decimal problems, we wanted to focus on what are problems that you present to a student that would trip them up. And the most common misconception that students have is this misconception of longer decimals being larger. So in other words, they think that those extra decimal places to the right, just because they've learned whole numbers before decimals, make a decimal larger. And that is a really common misconception. Maybe as many as 30 to 40% of sixth grade, seventh grade students, which is the population I work with, have that misconception. So that helped us to know what kind of problems we'd want. So an obvious kind of problem would be give them a handful of decimals to put in order and make sure that all the decimals are different lengths, but that the longer ones are actually smaller than the shorter ones, so that it kind of goes against that misconception, for instance. So that's how we started with the content. And then we looked at different game ideas, and we realized that I'm at a university, so I have some limitations on designing a wide breadth of game elements. So we decided, well, let's pick a smaller set of game elements, but come up with multiple ways to do the same thing with respect to, let me continue with the example that I gave you, that you have a handful of decimals you have to put in order. Well, I gave one example earlier where I mentioned about this Western shooter game where you shoot the decimals in a certain order. We did that in the context of a Western motif, but then we also came up with a Space Invader version of that, where there's spaceships floating around that have decimals on them, which is similar to that Western shooter game, and students would shoot those. Or there was another one where we came up with, you had to pick gas canisters to support spaceships, and they had to be picked in the order of the decimals. So we basically started with the core notion of they have to sort these decimals. And then we just thought of different ways that we could put that in a gameful context as one example. But that process was really exciting and fun for me. And one of the reasons I decided to continue in this vein of research, because it's just really fun to work with, particularly game designers. Now, I came into this without being a game designer. I've collaborated with a number of game designers, and most particularly a colleague of mine at CMU who's done a lot of game design. Her name's Jess Hammer, where I've kind of learned these techniques that she teaches and that she's used herself to develop games. So working closely with her really made a huge difference in the development of this game.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much for talking through this. Your work is obviously really, really interesting. Before we wrap up, one thing I just kind of want to ask you as sort of takeaways for our audience. So if people in our audience are looking to design a game, whether it's for an adult audience, as many of them are, or a younger audience, if you want to have a game that's meaningful learning and creative and fun to do, what are the key things to think about when you're doing that?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. I could probably talk about that for a long time, but
I'm sure.
I'll keep it really short if I can. So I think it's really important to always keep in mind principles that come from learning science and what we've learned about humans learning. It's easy to fall into the trap of, the intuitions that we have, but it's better, I think, to follow what empirical evidence has shown us. And with learning science, just an example that I mentioned earlier is this idea of explanation and self-explanation. There is so much evidence that if after you've solved a problem, you prompt a person to explain what they've done, that reinforces their knowledge in such a way that it helps their overall learning. There's also so much evidence about presenting, especially a new topic to a student, to give them an example, a worked example of how to solve something, or and again, that's maybe that's an intuitive thing that a lot of people maybe would think of anyway, but there's also lots of evidence that makes a big difference. So I would say that, kind of the main thing I would suggest is refer to learning science principles, such as the couple that I've just cited, as the background. Don't just sort of intuit what you think is the way to learn something, but use the evidence.
Oh, thanks so much. And really, it sounds like make it fun, but make it fun and keep the research in mind so that you don't fall into the trap of creating a game that's a fun game, but really doesn't have enough meaningful learning in it.
Exactly.
For the person using it.
Exactly.
Terrific. Well, Bruce, thanks again for your time. It's wonderful talking to you and hearing about what you're doing. And thanks again for taking the time to talk with me.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.